So the Wobblies said, look, you know, by hook or by crook, we're going to be able to do this. And so when their buildings were burned down, they went out onto the streets and they put up soapboxes and get up on the soapboxes and start, you know, just street speaking, you know, exhorting, calling everybody to come on out and join a fighting union that'll stand up for their rights against the invasions of the bosses and the cops. And they were good at it. You know, they'd always set up their boxes right across the street from the Starvation Army. And so people over there would be, you know, Bible banging and Jesus preaching and telling these working folks to give everything they had to Jesus so they could get pie in the sky. Meanwhile, the union was over there telling you that, look, this is something that you got to deal with on earth right now, and if you want something for yourself, the best way to do it is to get together with your fellow workers. And people would flock across the street from the Starvation Army and all the other charities and come on out and join up with the union. This scared the tar out of the bosses and out of the law. So the city fathers in Spokane passed an ordinance which was prohibiting free speech, right? That banned speaking openly in public, and it applied to everybody except the Salvation Army. Well, that's intolerable, and these workers knew it was intolerable. They knew it was intolerable not because they had a philosophy of freedom that they'd spent working out in books and in writing, but because they knew freedom as a lived experience, because they knew that freedom is something that you have to take for yourself, because they knew that the state can't give you free speech and the state can't take it away. It's something that you're born with. It's something that if they try to take it from you, you live out in the process of resisting and in the process of making yourself free. So they said, well, okay, we're going to resist. And again, did they hire on a lawyer to take it into court and argue the First Amendment? No. Did they hire a lobbyist to go in and try and persuade the city fathers to treat a bunch of out-of-work, immigrant, half non-English speaking, half illiterate laborers seriously as a group of people whose rights deserve to be respected? No, that wouldn't have worked. So what they did instead was they put out a call. Everybody in the territory who'd been cut loose from a job and said, come on into Spokane, it's a free, you know, we're having a free speech fight here. They're trying to take away our right to speak freely and associate freely in public. And they loaded up workers, every out-of-work worker in the whole Pacific Northwest and the interior West, loaded onto freight train after freight train, filled them up, came into town, and the Wobblies took a soapbox down to Trent Avenue, put it down there in defiance of the law, and they built a line of workers about 4 blocks down and 4 blocks up, and each one of those workers would take his turn getting up on that soapbox. Each one of those fellow workers would have about enough time to get up on that soapbox and say, fellow workers, and then they'd get arrested. Right? Well, that was the point, though, to fill the jails. See, the workers each came up one after another, and the Finnish workers were actually the really tough ones, right? The Finnish workers were mostly revolutionaries when they got here. So a Finnish worker would learn sort of enough English to get up on that soapbox and say, fellow workers, and if there wasn't a cop right there, he'd say, where's that damn cop? So they filled the city jail up, and they filled the county jail up, and you know, all the high school gymnasiums, every square inch of public space was full up of these out-of-work unionists. And so it seemed like the city had won. They had them all locked up. They couldn't speak publicly anymore. But then they had to feed them. And the tax burden was enormous. And while the city government was trying to squeeze every last cent to be able to do something about this massive problem they created for themselves, tied up all their business, all the respectable citizens of Spokane were screaming and hollering at them that, you know, by God, you're not going to take our hard-earned loot to give it to that bunch of hobos locked up down in the slammer. And so the city had to change the ordinance, and the Wobblies won. And it didn't take any ballot boxes, it didn't take any political parties. It's called direct action, and it comes to us highly recommended. The lesson then that the story that I want to tell has, so I think this is a story with a moral, one with several morals that apply directly to those of us who follow in that same freedom struggle, and who I hope can begin to see ourselves as part of the same great struggle against government coercion and against government suppression of rights. Can learn from the example of groups like the Wobblies and other groups like them that flourished, sort of especially earlier in the 20th century, but that have continued on to this day. And the first lesson that I think we can learn is a lesson about anarchism and about limited government, about the kind of debates that we often have amongst ourselves as libertarians. The Wobblies didn't have a political litmus test. It was a union for all workers, and so regardless of your position, they would work for you and they would fight for your rights. But the organization was organized along anarchist principles. It was very influenced by the example of previous generations of anarchists in terms of how they organized and how they thought about what they were doing, who they conceived of as their main enemies and their main allies. And so what they were trying to do in struggles like the free speech fight in Spokane and other free speech fights in other cities across the West was not to try and bring about limited government. They were trying to limit government, but not to bring about a government that's limited. It was a matter of a verb, not a matter of a noun. The point was to create a process by which people are able to stop government from invading upon their rights, not to try and set up a permanent structure which would somehow limit itself or sort of make it not allowed for itself to invade other people's rights. Because if your hope is in a permanent structure like that, I think your hope is going to always be disappointed. And within the libertarian movement, in the anarchist versus sort of the no government, limited government debate, I think there are sort of two things that I want to emphasize quickly, and I'm not going to do justice to the whole debate, just out of limitations of time and wanting to try and talk to you all with some Q&A and give and take. But the couple things that I want to emphasize quickly are that there are sort of reasons of justice to be concerned about the possibility of government ever being a legitimate option, no matter how limited government is, and also reasons of practicality. Now, of these two, I actually think the reasons of justice are more important, but I'm going to give them some short shrift and talk more about the reasons of practicality. And the reason is not because they're more important, but rather because there's a connected issue which I think is extremely important, which is that a lot of these debates tend to revolve around a weird notion of practicality. They tend to revolve around a notion of practicality that amounts not to actually a serious concern for what gets the goods, for what actually will accomplish your stated goals for you, but rather sort of what most what kind of behavior most conforms with the kind of political etiquette that we've been taught by the governing classes. So briefly though, on the point of justice, I think that the primary thing to be concerned with in the anarchist-minarchist debate is a question of consent. I believe that Jefferson, in spite of his many faults, was right about something important when he said that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. What Jefferson didn't realize is that governments don't have the consent of the governed, not just the British Crown, but any government. No government anywhere has the consent of the governed, because in order for you to have consent, there has to be the possibility of refusing consent or withdrawing consent. There has to be the option to opt out before you can be said to have opted in. And the way that governments work as governments is to systematically exclude the individual from any possibility of opting out. If you and the Supreme Court of the United States disagree on a point of legal interpretation about your right to free speech or your right not to have your papers and effects made insecure, then who wins? Well, it's the Supreme Court of the United States. They're always going to win, and they're always going to win because they have an effective monopoly on the interpretation of the law, the specification of rights, and the use of force in order to take action according to the law. And so for you to have genuine consent to a system of government, which means, since taking money without consent is theft, for things like taxation to be anything other than robbery carried out by a criminal gang, it would have to be the case that you would have to be able to individually withdraw without penalty from government jurisdiction and to make a living for yourself freely, as long as you don't invade the livelihoods or property of anybody else, without taxation, without claims of special authority to regulate your conduct, and without requirements that you participate in or accept the forms of military and police protection that government